3 years ago, Sarah Mitchell sat across from the man she had built her life with, listening as he calmly explained why she no longer belonged in it. According to court records and later interviews, Daniel Mitchell had recently seen rapid success in his business, and those close to the couple said the shift changed more than just his finances. What started as quiet disagreements about money slowly became something sharper, more personal, until one sentence, simple, direct, and impossible to forget, ended everything. He told her she wasn't enough for the life he wanted anymore. Not successful enough, not ambitious enough, and, as he reportedly put it, not financially equal to the future he saw for himself. Within months, the marriage was over. The house they once shared no longer felt like hers even before she left it. And according to property filings, Daniel retained full ownership of the home, while Sarah walked away with very little. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next, according to financial reports and business filings, was something no one in Daniel's circle saw coming, and certainly not something he ever prepared for. In the months that followed, Sarah Mitchell disappeared from the life she once knew. Friends later said the silence was unusual, not because she was loud or attention-seeking before, but because she had always been present, dependable, the kind of person who showed up even when things were difficult. Then suddenly she was gone. No updates, no public statements, no visible attempt to challenge what had happened. According to those close to the situation, Daniel Mitchell moved on quickly. Within a short time, a new partner was introduced, and records show that she began spending time in the same home Sarah had once lived in. To outsiders, it looked like a clean break, a man continuing forward with success, leaving behind a chapter that no longer fit his narrative. But what wasn't visible at the time was what Sarah was doing away from all of it. There were no headlines about her, no social media posts hinting at a comeback, no dramatic declarations. Instead, there were small, quiet moves. According to later financial disclosures, Sarah began taking courses in business and finance, areas she had never been deeply involved in before. She took on work that, by most standards, would seem far removed from the life she once had, and people who crossed paths with her during that period described someone focused, almost unrecognizable in her level of discipline. Investigators of her later success would note that this phase was where everything began to shift, not outwardly, but internally, where the foundation for what would come next was being built piece by piece. And while Sarah was rebuilding from the ground up, Daniel's world, at least on the surface, continued to expand. His company saw growth, new partnerships were announced, and according to business reports, revenue increased steadily during that period. To most observers, there was no reason to question the trajectory. But as some analysts would later point out, rapid growth often carries risks that aren't immediately visible, and decisions made during that time would eventually come under closer scrutiny. At the time, though, no one was connecting these two separate paths. The quiet, unseen work of a woman starting over, and the visible success of a man who believed he had already left her behind. And that disconnect, as it turns out, was exactly what allowed the next phase of this story to unfold without anyone noticing, until it was far too late to ignore. As the second year passed, the gap between what people saw and what was actually happening grew wider. Publicly, Daniel Mitchell's company appeared stable, even impressive, with announcements that suggested expansion into new markets and partnerships that gave the impression of long-term security. According to business reports from that period, the company was attracting attention from mid-level investors, and on paper, everything pointed upward. But some analysts later noted that growth at that pace often depends on fragile timing, where one miscalculation can expose everything underneath. Around the same time, Sarah Mitchell's name began appearing quietly in places no one from her past was looking. Not in headlines, not in interviews, but in filings, registrations, and small ownership stakes that, individually, didn't seem significant. According to financial documents, she wasn't acting impulsively or emotionally. Every move appeared measured, almost cautious, as if she understood that visibility too early could change the outcome. People who later reviewed these records suggested that she wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was studying a system she had once been excluded from, learning how influence works when it's not obvious, when it doesn't need recognition to be effective. And while Daniel continued making decisions from a position of confidence, those same decisions began creating openings that only someone paying close attention would recognize. Investigators and financial commentators would later point out that certain shares changed hands during a period when the company's valuation dipped briefly, a moment that passed quickly enough that most people never noticed. But according to those same reports, that brief window mattered because it was during that time that a series of acquisitions began, carried out through intermediaries and entities that didn't immediately trace back to Sarah, at least not until much later. To Daniel and to everyone watching from the outside, nothing seemed out of place. The company was still his, the narrative was still his, and the past felt distant enough to no longer matter. But behind that sense of control, something had already started shifting. And by the time anyone realized who was quietly stepping into position, the structure of power had already begun to change in ways that couldn't be undone. By the time the third year began, the first visible signs of strain started to surface, though not in ways that immediately raised alarm. According to financial coverage and internal summaries that would later circulate, a few of Daniel Mitchell's expansion decisions began to underperform. Nothing dramatic at first, just projections that didn't fully materialize, partnerships that delivered less than expected, and a subtle tightening of margins that most outsiders wouldn't recognize as a warning. But within the company, those shifts mattered. People close to the operations reportedly noticed changes in tone during meetings, a growing urgency that hadn't been there before. And while Daniel remained publicly confident, the structure beneath that confidence was beginning to rely more heavily on short-term corrections rather than long-term stability. Around the same period, Sarah Mitchell's involvement, still largely invisible, became more direct. According to later disclosures, the entities that had been acquiring small stakes began consolidating those positions. What once looked like scattered, unrelated investments started forming a pattern, one that only became clear when viewed as a whole. Analysts who reviewed the timeline suggested that this was not accidental. It appeared coordinated, patient, and timed with an understanding of when resistance would be weakest. And perhaps most notably, there was still no public connection linking these moves back to her. To Daniel, nothing seemed out of the ordinary beyond the usual pressures of running a growing company. He continued to make executive decisions, continued to expand, and according to those who worked with him, continued to believe he was firmly in control. But control, as some experts later explained, isn't always about what's visible in the moment. Sometimes it shifts quietly, in documents, in percentages, in agreements signed without full awareness of their future impact. The turning point, according to multiple reports, came during a closed-door board discussion that was never intended to attract attention. It was described as routine, a meeting focused on stabilizing recent performance concerns. But within that room, something unexpected happened. Voting power, which had long been assumed to be secure, no longer aligned the way it once had. Shares that Daniel believed were firmly within his influence were now being represented differently. And for the first time, questions began to surface about who actually held control. What followed, according to those familiar with the situation, was a realization that didn't happen all at once, but in pieces, each one more unsettling than the last. Because the name behind the shift, the one that had remained absent from every visible part of his world for years, was about to reappear in the one place he never expected to see it again. At first, it didn't register all at once. According to people familiar with the meeting, the documents were reviewed the same way they always were: numbers checked, signatures confirmed, voting positions outlined. But then something didn't align. A percentage that should have been fixed had changed. A block of shares that had once supported Daniel Mitchell's decisions was now listed under a different controlling interest. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, as the room tried to make sense of it. And then, as additional documents were placed on the table, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The ownership structure of the company had shifted, not dramatically in appearance, but decisively in outcome. Control, the one thing Daniel had never questioned, was no longer entirely his. According to reports that later summarized the moment, it was confirmed through a series of filings that had been completed over time, each one legally sound, each one building toward a position that now carried weight. And at the center of those filings was a name no one in that room expected to see: Sarah Mitchell. For a moment, there was no reaction that could match what that meant. This wasn't a sudden takeover. It wasn't an aggressive move made overnight. It was something slower, something constructed with precision, layered over months and years until it reached a point where it could no longer be reversed. People who later analyzed the situation suggested that what made it so effective wasn't just the timing, but the silence. There had been no warnings because there had been no visibility. And by the time the reality became clear, the structure supporting Daniel's authority had already been replaced. What followed, according to those present, was a shift in tone that no one could control. The conversation moved from routine discussion to something far more serious as legal confirmations were requested and verified. And with each confirmation, one fact became harder to deny. The company Daniel believed he still led was no longer entirely under his control. What happened next, according to accounts from individuals familiar with the meeting, unfolded with a level of calm that made it even more difficult to process. There was no raised voice, no dramatic interruption, no moment that signaled what was coming in a way people could prepare for. Instead, the confirmation came through procedure. Legal counsel reviewed the filings. Voting rights were recalculated. Control thresholds were verified against the company's own governance rules. And with each step, the conclusion remained the same. The balance of power had shifted, not temporarily, not conditionally, but in a way that was fully recognized within the structure of the company itself. At that point, the question was no longer whether something had changed, but how far that change extended. According to summaries that later circulated, Sarah Mitchell's position was not symbolic. It was decisive. The shares tied to her name, directly and through associated entities, represented a controlling interest. That meant decisions could now be made without Daniel's approval, a reality that, until that moment, had not been considered possible by those in the room. Then came the part that, by most accounts, no one forgot. A formal statement was introduced, prepared in advance, structured in the language of corporate governance. It wasn't emotional. It didn't reference the past. It simply outlined a transition in leadership, citing performance concerns and strategic direction as justification. Those familiar with the process said it followed standard procedure, the kind used in many executive changes. But the context made it different, because the authority behind that document came from someone Daniel had once believed no longer had any place in his world. The vote was called, and according to those present, it did not take long. Once the numbers were confirmed, the outcome was clear. Daniel Mitchell was no longer in control of the company he had built. And as the final confirmation was recorded, another line was added to the proceedings, one that would later be repeated in every retelling of the story. His position as CEO had been terminated, effective immediately. For a moment, there was silence, not the kind that comes from confusion, but the kind that follows something final. People in the room reportedly understood that they were witnessing more than a leadership change. They were seeing the end of a narrative that had once seemed fixed, and at the center of it was a reversal no one had anticipated. The woman who had left with nothing now held everything that determined what came next. But what made this moment linger wasn't just the outcome. It was what it represented. Because for those who later examined the full timeline, the question wasn't simply how Sarah regained power. It was why she chose this path and what it ultimately meant to her. And that answer, according to people who would speak about her decisions afterward, was not as straightforward as it first appeared. In the days that followed, the story didn't explode all at once. It moved quietly at first, circulating through industry circles, then reaching wider attention as filings became public and analysts began connecting the timeline. According to business coverage that referenced the transition, the leadership change was framed as a strategic decision, supported by performance concerns and long-term direction. There was no mention of the past, no reference to the personal history between the two individuals at the center of it, but people who had known them before recognized the names immediately, and the connection spread quickly. What stood out to many observers wasn't just the outcome, but the absence of anything that resembled revenge. There were no statements from Sarah Mitchell addressing what had happened years earlier, no interviews revisiting the divorce, no attempt to reshape the narrative publicly. According to those who interacted with her after the transition, Her focus remained on the company itself, stabilizing operations, restructuring decisions that had created risk, and restoring confidence among employees and partners. It was a response that, to some, felt unexpected, because the version of this story most people imagined would have ended with confrontation, with closure delivered in words. Instead, it ended with silence and control. Meanwhile, Daniel Mitchell's departure was handled through standard corporate procedure. Reports indicated that exit terms were negotiated, responsibilities transferred, and communication to staff kept concise. Those familiar with internal reactions said the mood was mixed, some surprised, others less so, particularly those who had seen the earlier signs of strain within the company. Analysts who later reviewed the transition suggested that the outcome, while dramatic in its context, followed patterns that exist in many business environments, where control is determined not by history or perception, but by structure, timing, and decisions made long before the final moment arrives. And when the full picture was finally visible, one detail continued to stand out. Everything that happened at the end had been set in motion long before anyone realized it was even possible. The years between the divorce and the boardroom weren't empty. They were filled with choices that individually seemed small, but together reshaped the entire outcome. And that's what leaves a question that doesn't have a simple answer. When someone is underestimated to that degree, when they're removed from a space and expected to disappear from it entirely, what determines whether they accept that version of the story or quietly begin rewriting it from the outside? As the weeks turned into months, the story settled into something more complex than a simple rise and fall narrative. According to follow-up reports and commentary from business analysts, Sarah Mitchell's leadership began to reshape the company in ways that weren't immediately visible to the public, but were deeply felt internally. Departments were reorganized, long-standing contracts were reviewed, and decisions that once prioritized rapid expansion were replaced with a more measured, sustainable approach. Employees who spoke anonymously in later coverage described a shift in atmosphere, less pressure to chase short-term wins, more focus on stability and long-term growth. It wasn't dramatic from the outside, but it was deliberate. And for those paying attention, it reflected a leadership style built not on proving a point, but on ensuring the structure could hold under pressure. At the same time, interest in Daniel Mitchell's next steps grew, though information remained limited. According to available records, he stepped away from public-facing roles for a period, and while there were reports suggesting potential new ventures, nothing immediately matched the scale of what he had lost. Analysts who commented on the situation often pointed out that transitions like this are rarely defined by a single moment. They are shaped by what follows, by how individuals respond when control is removed and expectations shift. In that sense, the story didn't truly end in the boardroom. It extended beyond it, into decisions that would be made quietly, away from attention, much like the ones that had led to that moment in the first place. And perhaps that's what continues to hold people's attention. Not just the reversal of roles, but the contrast in how each phase of the story unfolded. One visible, confident, and widely recognized. The other patient, restrained and almost entirely unnoticed until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. According to those who have studied similar cases, that contrast is often where the most important lessons exist. Because power, as this story suggests, doesn't always announce itself when it begins to change. Sometimes it moves in silence, shaped by decisions that seem insignificant at the time, but carry consequences that only become clear much later. And when those consequences finally surface, they tend to raise a question that stays with people long after the details fade. If you were in that position, faced with being dismissed, underestimated, and removed from something you helped build, would you walk away and accept it as the end? Or would you choose a path that no one else could see and wait until the moment came to redefine everything? As more time passed, the narrative surrounding Sarah Mitchell began to shift from curiosity to analysis. According to industry commentary and leadership profiles that referenced her transition into control, her approach became a case study in restraint and timing. She didn't rush to make symbolic moves, didn't attempt to rewrite the company's story overnight. Instead, decisions were layered carefully, often explained through internal memos rather than public announcements. People familiar with the company's operations noted that trust, once uncertain, started to rebuild under consistency rather than spectacle. It was a contrast that many observers found compelling, because in a situation that could have easily turned into a public confrontation, she chose a path that kept the focus on outcomes rather than history. And that choice, according to leadership analysts, may have been what ultimately solidified her position. At the same time, discussions about Daniel Mitchell's earlier decisions continued to surface, not as accusations, but as reflections. Commentators pointed out that moments of rapid success can sometimes create blind spots, especially when personal and professional lines begin to overlap. According to those perspectives, the assumption that someone no longer has influence simply because they are no longer visible can be a critical miscalculation. And in this case, that assumption appears to have played a defining role in how events unfolded. What makes this story stay with people isn't just the outcome, but the way it challenges expectations about how change happens. There was no single dramatic turning point that everyone saw in real time. No obvious signal that something irreversible had begun. Instead, it was a sequence of decisions, each one building quietly on the last, until the final result seemed sudden only because no one had been watching closely enough. And that's where the deeper reflection begins. Because beyond the details of business and personal history, there's a broader question about perception. How often do people mistake silence for absence? How often do they assume that someone who steps away has stopped moving forward entirely? According to those who have studied similar patterns, that assumption is more common than most would expect. And it's often what creates the space for outcomes like this to take shape. By the time the full story is understood, the most important parts have already happened, unnoticed, unchallenged, and impossible to reverse, which leaves one final thought that continues to spark debate among those who hear it. When someone is underestimated, not once but repeatedly, does that become their limitation, or does it become their greatest advantage in the end? In the end, the story of Sarah Mitchell and Daniel Mitchell is not just about a marriage that ended or a company that changed hands. According to reports, filings, and the perspectives of those who later examined the full timeline, it became something far more layered than a simple story of loss and comeback. It was about how quickly perception can define value, and how dangerously wrong that perception can be. 3 years earlier, Sarah was seen as someone who no longer fit into a future that was being built without her. She was dismissed, reduced to a limitation rather than recognized as a possibility. And yet, everything that followed suggests that what was overlooked in that moment didn't disappear. It evolved quietly, steadily, and with a level of discipline that never needed validation to continue moving forward. Daniel, on the other hand, represented a path that many understand all too well. Success that arrives quickly, confidence that grows alongside it, and decisions that begin to rely more on assumption than awareness. According to analysts and commentators, there was no single mistake that caused his downfall, but rather a series of choices that, over time, created an environment where control could shift without immediate resistance. And when that shift finally became visible, it wasn't sudden. It only felt that way because the early stages had gone unnoticed. What makes this story resonate isn't just the reversal of roles, but the way it challenges the idea of finality. A moment that seems like an ending can, in reality, be the beginning of something far more significant. Being underestimated, dismissed, or even removed from a position does not always define the outcome. Sometimes it creates the space for a different kind of growth, one that happens without pressure, without attention, and without the need to prove anything to anyone until the moment is right. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't always come with noise or warning. It comes with clarity, with results that speak for themselves, with a reality that no longer needs explanation. So the question this story leaves behind isn't just about what Sarah did or what Daniel lost. It's about perspective, about how often people decide someone's worth based on where they are in a single moment, without considering where they might be heading. Because if this story shows anything, it's that the most important transformations don't always happen in front of an audience. They happen in silence over time, until one day they can no longer be ignored. And when that day comes, the outcome doesn't just change a situation. It changes how the entire story is understood. In the years that followed, the version of life Daniel Mitchell had chosen did not unfold in the way many expected. According to people familiar with his situation, The relationship that once seemed like an upgrade began to carry its own pressures. What had started with excitement and confidence gradually shifted into something quieter, more complicated. The same ambition that had once driven him forward now came with expectations that were harder to meet, especially after losing the company that had defined so much of his identity. Those who observed from a distance said there was a noticeable change in how he carried himself. Less certainty, fewer public appearances, and a growing sense that something had been lost beyond just a business position. Reports and commentary suggested that his new relationship, once seen as a symbol of moving on, became a constant reminder of the decision that led him there. Conversations, according to those close to the situation, were no longer about building something new, but about managing what remained. Without the influence and stability he once had, the dynamic between them reportedly changed. The confidence that attracted people to him in the beginning was no longer as visible, and with that shift came tension that wasn't there before. It wasn't dramatic or public, but it was steady, the kind of strain that builds over time rather than all at once. Meanwhile, comparisons to Sarah Mitchell's quiet success became harder to ignore. Even without direct contact, her name continued to surface in business discussions, leadership circles, and reports about the company's recovery. According to analysts, her decisions brought stability where there had once been uncertainty, and that contrast only deepened the reflection around Daniel's earlier choices. People who once supported his perspective reportedly began to reconsider it, not openly, but in the way conversations changed tone when his name came up. It was no longer about what he had built, but about what he had lost and how it happened. For Daniel, according to those who later spoke about his situation, the realization didn't come in a single moment. It came gradually through small reminders, a familiar place that no longer felt the same, a conversation that echoed something he once dismissed, a version of his life that looked complete on the surface but felt different underneath. Regret, as some described it, wasn't loud or immediate. It was quiet, persistent, and shaped by understanding that arrived too late to change anything. And perhaps that's what makes this part of the story resonate the most. Not the fall itself, but what follows after. Because losing something valuable doesn't always feel real in the moment it happens. Sometimes it takes distance, time, and perspective to fully understand what was given up. And by the time that understanding settles in, the opportunity to go back is no longer there. So when people look at how everything unfolded, the question isn't just about success or failure. It's about choices, about how easily something meaningful can be replaced in the moment, only to be missed in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And for Daniel Mitchell, according to those who observed his later life, that realization became part of his everyday reality, not through dramatic events, but through the quiet awareness that what he once had was something he would never have again.